today we have our esteemed guests who are scholars, artists, and activists, and everything. I mean, it's such. I'm so honored to be among our three guests. I welcome Aniruddha Knight. Aniruddha, I have to tell you that I watched your the documentary on your grandmother when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and it's still stuck in my head. I have that vision of her doing the Natadavu with the braid coming down like that. And it must be, I mean, we'll learn more about your experience growing up in that household, I think, but that kind of was the epitome of performance for me as a child. And I've, it's really heartwarming. Then we have Yashoda Thakore. She is a scholar, professor. She's teaching at Silicon Andhra. A lot of our IDEA members actually did a master's and were her students, and she was their thesis advisor. And of course, she is the illustrious dancer. So welcome, Yashoda ji. And we have Pallabi Chakravarty, who's been a partner for IDEA for many, many years. We've had interactions with her and invited her to share her scholarly research with us as well as her dance. I think a few years ago, your courtyard dancers also came and performed at an IDEA festival, if I'm not wrong. But welcome, everybody. I'm going to quickly spotlight you so it will pretend you walked in on stage. So while I'm doing that, I would like each of you to just take a moment and share a quick thought before we actually start the question and answer round of it. Aniruddha, do you want to go first?
Sure, why not? First of all, many thanks for having me to be a part of this discussion. I think it's been a long-awaited thing to be doing something with IDEA anyway. From Vidya Shankaranarayanaka, I've been learning so much from you about you and your organization. So I come from a lineage of dancers that date back to the mid 18th century. Not just dancers, but also musicians. The influence of my particular family, I mean, what we know on record and what I relate to in my family. So I can't really talk about Papa Mal. I can't talk about Kamachi Amma that much. I can't even talk about Veena Dadamal that much. But I can definitely talk about from the influence of my grandmother to my mother and then to me. So my idea, my influence, my art, and what I learned about the family and the entire family setup came from my mother. So as I say often, Bala Saraswati Amma is just an icon for me as is for everybody else.
Right.
So this family, as you know, as far as resilience of how it's survived through the generations, it's gone through its ups and downs. It's been popular, it's been unpopular, it's been recognized, it's been unrecognized, but somehow it's been able to maintain a certain integrity of what it does musically and artistically. So that's what I learned from them. Other than specifically talking about the art itself, I just wanted to mention what that art's foundation is for me.
Right.
Yes, I mean, as being growing up in the US and also being biracial and bicultural in a lot of aspects, for me to keep my American side very American and to keep my Indian side in my art stick to its roots and its classical, at least from my perspective.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
I think that'll be really interesting for a lot of our audiences too.
Yes.
They're having the two cultural experiences and impacting upbringing, right?
Yes. My father, I've been very fortunate to have my father who he celebrated his 50th year of playing the mridangam about
Wow.
2 years ago. And he was fortunate enough to learn from Kupusami Mudaliyar, who was Balama's accompanist, who in another aspect, it did not have any other students who he taught. So that was specific playing for Bharatanatyam for Balama style that he learned. And he was
Wow.
fortunate enough to learn from T. Ranganathan, who was Balama's brother. So in the household, I always had that the art was the foundation for the household. Yeah, that was the cohesive glue that really kept everything together in the house. So for me, even though I grew up in the US, please let me know when I'm going over time and not and saying too much. So please do let me know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now,
yeah. So yes, please go on.
Okay, we'll come back to you. So
Sure.
Yashoda ji, would you like to say a few introductory words?
Pallavi first, and then I'll go after.
Oh, okay.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Hi, namaskar everyone. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you, Shruti, for inviting me. Thank you, Yashoda ji, for letting me speak first. So I will be very brief. I don't come from a musical family, although my aunt, I mean, to be actually absolutely specific about this, my aunt, her name was Dipali Nag. She was a very well-known vocalist, and she was trained by Faiz Khan, the great Faiz Khan, so of Agra Gharana. But my, my parents are, generally speaking, none of my close relatives ever danced or are professional musicians or dancers. I studied with my guru, Bandana Sen. She was trained by Shambhu Maharaj, the great Shambhu Maharaj, and Jai Kumari Devi of Jaipur Gharana. So she has this beautiful, dance which has both gharanas in the tradition. And then before that, I also was in Children's Little Theatre, CLT, where I learned various different dance styles, including Bharatanatyam from Shankar Narayan, who came from Thankumani Kutri school, part of that family. And so also learned Kathakali from Balkrishna Menon and lots of folk styles. So there's been a lot of dance in me. And before that, if I even want to go back to my childhood, interestingly, my family lived with Uday Shankar's family. So that was my very early, I don't remember a lot, but I do have this relationship with the Uday Shankar family, from very early on. So dance has always been there around me, I can say, although, my family has not been connected to it in a very kind of a bloodline kind of a way. And then, of course, I studied with my guru for many, many years and immersed in the Kathak form. And then I researched it. And then I got my doctoral degree from Temple University here in visual anthropology. And then I started teaching at Swarthmore College. To make a long story short, I also do scholarship, and I have a company here, or I would rather say it's a community-oriented organization, Kotiya Dancers. And I like to choreograph and ask a lot of questions and explore. I'm still learning. I feel like I'll always be a student all my life.
Yeah.
With Indian dance, there's no end to it. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Shruti, for calling me over. Thank you, Aidya and Pallabi and Aniruddha. Such a pleasure to be here with the two of you. I come from a family called the families of Kalavantulu. Kalavantulu are what we know commonly as the Devadasis, but the Devadasis of the Andhra area. I will talk about the United Andhra area because in my mind, the state has not divided as yet.
Yeah.
So these ladies, they were the unmarried ones. We know about the Devadasis, right? But it was my grandmother's grandmother who was the last singer dancer, Kotipalli Madhuravani and Pichayamma. When I started learning dance, I started with Kuchipudi, and I didn't know anything about the background. So it's not like Aniruddha, who knew where he comes from and is part of the lineage. So when I was about 3.5, I just declared that I want to be learning dance. I want to be dancing. My parents put me into dance much against the wish of the extended family, but they waited. There were lots of conditions. They didn't put me with an individual dance master. No, not at all. It had to be a woman, and it had to be an institute. So I couldn't care. I just needed to dance. So I waited. And that's when Dr. Vempati Chinnasatyam had started the Kuchipudi Art Academy in Hyderabad. And I was enrolled there. It was an institution. Even though he's a man, the teacher was my teacher, Shobha Naidu. So essentially, I'm a student of Mrs. Shobha Naidu. And because 14 years I have been with her, 14 years, I have not so much as seen another dancer. So that was complete Gurukulam for me. It was after that when I was doing my master's, it was actually around my 18th, 19th year when I was doing these dance dramas with my teacher and we had the musicians. I was completely involved in everything, right from the set work and everything else in that classes. The musicians would say, "You're very pretty, your families, women are very pretty in your families. Lot of devotion for Krishna. Women in your families have a lot of devotion." So I thought they were giving my mother a compliment, and I went back to her and I told her this. So that's when she sat me down and she said, "Now I need to talk to you." And then she said, "My parents told me that we come from a family called Kalavantulu. This is the Devadasi family. And what do? They used to dance in the temples at one time." So this is the important part, because they never told me that they never kind of made it dreamy. They said we heard that they used to dance in the temple at one time. We do not know anything about it. But what we have seen of our elders is not palatable at all. So we don't talk about it. We are equated to prostitutes. So when people talk about us, they talk about us as prostitutes. Bhogam varu, sani varu. So we don't say that name anywhere. And we also don't talk about the place we come from, Peddapuram, because that is supposed to be a red light area. It's known for sex work.
Okay.
So there's a history for that. And
Right.
there's an incident because these women moved away from there and others came in there under the name of Kalavantulu and started sex work.
Right.
So that was quite a death blow for the women, because it was just adding, applying salt on the wound.
Right.
So we don't talk about the place either. Then came the age of 21. By then, everybody knows, about your community in India. You may not know your community, but everybody around you will know your community. There was a point when people tried to put me down saying, "Oh, of course, Sheila, she's very friendly because she's from the Kalavantulu, the Bhogam community." Bhogam was what they used to call. Bhogam means entertainment, pleasure. So yeah, Bhogam Dikara. So she will be friendly. And my father was actually well placed by then. He was a government, he retired as a government official. We were very well to do. We were placed very well in society. I was, till my high school, I had a guardian who would take me and bring me back. That kind of, that super insulation from society
Right.
is there for me. I didn't know why. I would always ask my mother, why none of my friends have a bodyguard coming. Why do I have somebody escorting me to school and back?
Right.
And I would ask him to stand half a kilometer away because I would be with my friends. But when I began to listen to these things and I connected, I said, okay, why am I giving this chance to others to say this? Why not I say it myself? Why do I have to say I'm a Naidu or something else? I will say I'm from the Kalavantalu, because who gets the opportunity to do something that comes through the family? So who gets the opportunity not to have to do software, but do the dance and music? So I have to, so I told my mother, I will say this. If asked, I will say that I am from the Kalavantalu families. So, and I kept looking and looking for people who would teach me this. You know, I was 20, 21, and there was not much reading that I had done in this area other than the Natya Shastra. So when I kept looking, after my master's, I saw Mrs. Swapna Sundari do the Vilasini Natyam, and that was actually Dr. Nataraja Ramakrishna spoke to me about it during my master's program.
Mm-hmm.
He was the head of the department then, and he spoke to all of us in class about the Devadasi system and everything else. So I went to him and I asked him, you do the Andhra Natyam, which you say is the dance of the Kalavantalu. I want to learn this. And he would not teach me.
Oh.
His statement was, you come from the Kalavantalu family, get married and settle down. That's a statement I fail to understand even now, but then he even identified whom I should get married to, which I didn't do, of course. And but then came Mrs. Swapna Sundari, who claimed that she was teaching the Kalavantalu dance. So I said, okay, I want to learn this. And I did. For a long time, I learned it and I performed it. But then it's not, here I am. This is the dance of my family and I'm learning it through somebody else. So I kept asking, can we go back to any of them? No, all of them are dead and gone. Doesn't matter, whoever is left, even if they're not dancing. And then there was Devesh who came and he said, okay, let's go back. He was the person who took me first to these people of my family. And after that, it was easy because once I introduced myself and then they took me as one of them, then I could just move around and connect with them. And I must tell you, it's a different life after I've connected with them. Learning from them, just being with them, learning to cook from them, learning the language from them. And I cannot claim anything about the temple. None of them say they've been dedicated to the temple or anything, because they say, we don't know. It was our great grandmothers who used to do that. So we can't give you any authentic information about it. Right. We'll talk from the zamindari time. We'll talk from the courtly time, which is totally fine, because for some reason, there is an attempt to not talk about this part of it. Right. This part of the Devadasi life or the Kalavantalu life, which is most important, because this is life. This is the history of these women. Right. And how they survived it. I'm sorry if I took too much time.
No, that's okay. I'm sure everybody was equally riveted as I was to listen to this, your story. And I think it's very interesting, the contrast of Balama owning her identity, right? And she said, I don't care what's happening around here, but I am who I am, versus your family saying, we don't even talk about it. So until you started searching, there was no acceptance of that identity, right? It's very interesting how society plays so much of a role in forming all these identities or reclaiming or not, right? So I think it's such an interesting, actually that should be its own topic, but it's so much to learn always. But coming back to our conversation, I would like each of you to talk about, each of you gave me your personal anecdote, but then in your research, in your thing, what have you, like for a lay person growing up here in the US, just understanding that all these dance styles exist and they're learning probably one of them, what would be a quick, like, I mean, unfortunately, somewhat simplistic view of the history of performance in India? I mean, we know it started as community dances, at folk dances and things like that, this whole evolution of classical styles. Regionally, if each of you can speak a little bit about it, it'll be great. Any of you can go first. Pallabi?
Pallabi ji?
We both pick.
Okay, I will go first. Okay, this is a very large topic. So I will try to summarize and simplify, right? And especially, obviously, I'll be talking about Kathak. But as you can see from the very beginning, I mean, it is, Kathak belongs to multiple regions also. Like, it's not just diversity, you know, it really speaks to the pluralistic aspect of India to begin with, because it is multilingual, it's multi-religious, it's cosmopolitan, it's courtly, you know, what you were talking about, that, so I will speak about this topic from my interrogation and engagement with it as a Kathak dancer, as I learned in India, in Calcutta, where I grew up, right? You know, I mean, the history of Kathak, I got interested because my teacher, first of all, I learned from a female teacher. For a very short time, I was with Vijay Shankar at Padatik. But I also learned really deeply with my teacher, who's a female teacher. And I learned a lot from her, just listening to her stories of struggle, because she came from a very educated family, but her family was, had some difficulties. She had some financial difficulties. And I was confronted with all this messiness early on without understanding how to process it. And I did not learn. I also want to emphasize this because of the kind of discussion that gets attached to Indian dance and, you know, the particular caste and Brahminical identity that is attached to Indian classical dance right now. My teacher, I did not come from a very elite classroom, because my teacher was struggling, and she was also very generous. So she will accept students who came from lower socioeconomic spaces, and also from what we call the mafashals around Kolkata. So they were not even like from the city. They will come from small towns. And I've talked about this in my book, Bells of Change. And I talk about it as the lower middle class, you know, women, without, and not so much specifically talking about their caste identity, because that's not what we were talking about at that time, even in the academic context. But looking back, some of them did, like, you can tell what caste you are from your last names in India, right? Even if you want to hide it, it's like staring at you. So you can tell from that. And then some of them were just really coming from living, you know, like school teachers in villages, like small towns and things like that. And the stories that they narrate that can tell you where, you know, what kind of a socioeconomic background they're coming from. So I just wanted to mention that. So just hearing her stories, and she came of age because she was a child prodigy kind of thing. And so around her, there were the wives who were performing. So she was on stage with, you know, the courtesans of the Tawaives. So she would tell us these stories, and I didn't know how to process them at that time. Right. But that she was stigmatized, that was quite obvious to me, right? Because she was a middle class Bengali woman, you know, and she studied Urdu because her father was a barrister or whatever. But then that alienation or othering was already there because she was a dancer. You know, dance was, even in that generation, and I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s, it was struggling, right, to get that kind of respectability. Right. And because of her, you know, socioeconomic status, because of her mingling with the with the courtesans, or like people couldn't really distinguish perhaps between her and the courtesan. She was coming, she would say things like, oh, I will return home really late at night and be dressed like this. And people will say, look at that Baiji going, things like that. So I just heard these things without being able to understand. And later, of course, that's what actually initially, that's what became one of my biggest questions. That how come, despite that there are so many women all around me who are these very beautiful dancers, they are never respected as gurus. And that was a very simple question, like, why is a male always a guru? And then, of course, then you understand the lineages, the Brahminical lineages, and how those things have been legitimized by the state, right? So that's where all of these questions came from, just kind of learning this dance with her. And as you know that, Kathak, like I said, that it's a courtly culture that grew in the Islamic courts and the Hindu courts. And the idea of the Hindu and Muslim was not such a separate identity at that time. That's not how people identified themselves. So once I got deeply into the subject, and you understand that this was a courtesan culture, the Thumris, like and music and dance is not separate in India, right? You cannot understand dance without understanding music. Right. So the Thumri, like a really very simple example is the Thumri genre, right? Thumri used to be dance and music, both at the same time. Right. So that's the problem with modernity. Like when you think about colonialism, modernity, like the baggage of all of this is so deep that it's very hard for us to understand how these categories have been constructed. And now they are kind of permanent and eternal. So the Thumri genre was music and dance, and it was developed by the courtesans. It's a genre of music and dance that belongs to the Tawaif, but who knows this, right? I mean, only if you specialize in this. And Thumri has become mainly about singing, right? Because we know that that dance could not be recorded. So even when people are doing this kind of research, the ethnomusicologists who do this research, they know about the Thumri singers, not so much as the Thumri dancers. We know about Garjan, right? She's a very prominent Tawaif coming from that tradition. We know about one or two of them, but we know Garjan was also a Kathak dancer. Now people are kind of aware, but mostly people know about the genre through the women singers who were recorded. The dance was not recorded, but in the treaties, in the, you can see them, but also in the travelogues, in the colonial travelogues, in the paintings and the colonial, paintings, as well as the miniature paintings. So I will just stop here. I think that the Kathak history, now I've started saying that Kathak is the other of classical Indian dance because it doesn't fit, because it has been textualized, first of all, through Natya Shastra, Brahminized in such a way in modern India that, I was once asked in this country, there is in Philadelphia, there's an Indian organization. I do not want to mention the name, but the president of that institution asked me this question, that why do you do a foreign dance? So I just looked at him and I said, what do you mean foreign dance? So I think that that's what is so confusing, that, Islamic culture in India is not foreign. The Mughals are not foreign. It is part and parcel of how these genres grew. Music and dance is syncretic. It grew together, with these communities who, were working together. There were these hereditary communities of musicians and dancers, and they worked together. So it is such a difficult subject now to even go into the details of how do we even approach something like this, because now you look at Kathak and you see only it has become even more Hindu than it was before. All the genres, it's become reduced. Something that was really complex and large, because it comes from Amir Khusru's tradition, it comes from the Sufi Bhakti traditions, and it's been reduced to this much. The repertoire, everything has been reduced. So it's a vast subject. I will stop here, but I just want people to be aware of that there is a lot there. And one has to confront the fact that of all of these, like how I'm also implicated in some of these things. My class, my caste, my community, all of this is implicated in some of the things that happen. But as modern people, we should just be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yes. Yes, I think that's sort of the theme in all our lives right now, right? As we relearn and go back and investigate, and it's. I mean, I'm only sort of a consumer. I don't perform. I want to learn. I want to learn and share. That's all I'm like. That's all I want to be an instrument for at this stage of my life. So it's always so much to listen, and then of course there's all this, like you were saying, this implication of who you are comes into that, right? I mean, I'm Brahmin, but I've zero dance in my life before me, right? Ancestrally, my grandmother wanted to learn, and my grandfather said women in our family don't learn. And then suddenly everybody's like, no, our children must learn. So my sister started, then I wanted to dance, and we both are this sudden thing, but it wasn't anything to do with our Brahminical identity. It was just that we were all artistically excited. And then you realize there's so much other layers as you understand what has transpired, right? Aniruddha, you want to go next?
From a very interesting place to actually start from the conversation, because, no matter how much I can talk about my lineage, so many generations, we completely forget, we completely romanticize a lineage like this. We romanticize Bala Saraswati, but we completely forget the social inacceptance and difficulty of even today, of society needing to box this particular art form, to use the label as Devadasi dance, which I've never wrapped myself around that, because for me it's just dance.
Yes.
It's not anything else. And for me, what does that mean? What artistically, I'm not talking the social economic implications of naming something Devadasi dance. I'm talking about the artistic implication of labeling it and saying, okay, you've labeled it. So what is the difference? What are we doing here in trying to dissect it and then separate it and say, no, well, this is different from that for today's packaging. So I just want to come back to just the historical implication of what my family has gone through.
Right.
It's funny, within each and every generation, there was always a battle of saying, no more dance. And then it happens. And there was no more dance. And then people would say no dancing, and then it would happen. And then up to me, it was my mother, as when I was in a very final stages of her life, she always wanted me to have a 9-to-5 job. She wanted me to be comfortable financially. She didn't want me to go through the real ups and downs of not just being a dancer, but being from this particular community. So she would teach a lot, and then she would say, but remember this, you need to go to a job, you need to have a job. And I would nod my head. And then finally there was a turning point in my life, in my later teenagers. By the time I was 20, I needed to make a conscious decision whether I do this part-time, and find something comfortable for myself, or I do this wholeheartedly, whether it's successful, whether there's fame, whatever it is, there needs to be a continuation of what has been taught. So this battle has been fought even with my mother. She had to really fight to learn the dance and the music from her mother, and then had to redo the entire fight in society of claiming herself as Bala Saraswati's daughter, which had been very tough for her, and it's something that I still face for her. It's not something that was that just dissipated. So we go back to Balama's time, and by the time Balama started learning, there was also major discussions in the family whether she should learn. Music was the constant in the family. the knowledge of dance was there, but it wasn't performed publicly before Balama, for 4 generations.
Oh.
Before Bala Saraswati. So it was Balama was the cynosure. She was the turning point within the family where they said, okay, now we really need to bring the dance back into the performance perspective of the family art. So that's why that was the new blossoming of dance in the family. So when we talk about the dance, it is something from the turn of the 20th century onwards for us.
Mm-hmm.
So if I want to talk about the dance before that in my family, I can make all kinds of stuff. I can romanticize it how much ever I want, but I don't have an idea. So there's a certain, at least for me, even though it comes from a traditional landscape, there's a certain contemporary nature of the dance. Because particularly gurus such as Kandappa really made a point of leaving their own artistic mark. And if that entailed changing a lot of the dance, they took that liberty.
Okay.
So Balama was the reflection of that. You know, she was pretty much his sole student. And he created what he wanted to see aesthetically through Balama. She was the mold.
Okay.
So as being, there was no, in a sense, there was no style. The style was based on Kandappa's perspective of aesthetic on Balama. And that's something very, very hard to use as a cookie cutter for everybody else within the family. I'm not even talking outside of that. Even using that aesthetically is something very tough.
Right.
So coming back to the practicality of going back into what makes us uncomfortable, you know, because I'm very very wary of where I'm uncomfortable and where I put up my guard, right? Which is how I am. The label Devadasi, it is similar to Yashoda. I knew that we were performing family of performing artists, but the word Devadasi was actually never used within the household. It was only when I was 20 that I actually even understood that there was a derogatory use of the word for a lot of people. And that was a major shock for me. That was a major, oh no, wait a minute. Am I still here? Yes. I think you're gonna need to charge. That was a major shock. That was also, it aligned a lot of things. I always knew that my family went through a lot of financial hardships, a lot of sociological hardships, but it never occurred to me in that way. So by the time I came back to India, it made more sense of why there was this constantly needing to compartmentalize this into something else. Even being a male, for me, it complicated matters even further because I was a male artist doing something that was particularly done by a woman who was generally marginalized. So it feels like I get to be more marginalized for some other reason, including into that box. Because for me, performing, I don't go out of the genre of what my family does. So it's Kshatriya Padams, it is Tanjore quartet pieces. It is 90% based on Shringara. And that's what it is. But I am an artist from this family, and by someone's will, I was born into a tradition where I needed to carry it on. Yeah.
So I have a quick question for you before we
Sure.
go to Yashoda, because it just, when you said you have this thing to carry it on, was that, so was that self-imposed to carry it on?
It'll always be self-imposed, because when you grow up listening to so much of the music and seeing so much of the dance, I don't know how to separate myself from that. As Yashoda Akka said in her workshop, I don't know really anything else.
Okay.
Yes.
Yashoda.
Pallabi, that point that you said about no difference between Muslim and Islam, and Muslim and Hindu, Islam and Hindu. I come from Hyderabad, right? Hyderabad, where there is no difference at all for us. I should say there was no difference. So when we did Kuchipudi, Aniruddha, when you spoke about, you don't understand why the Devadasi dance, because the other form that exists here is the male specific Kuchipudi dance, which is done by Brahmins, Brahmin families. So if I am dancing something and they say this is Kuchipudi, if I do a Javali the way I have been taught by Ratna Kumari and I do say it is Kuchipudi, not that I would want to do it, I would not like to do it, but they won't accept it either. Number one. And also to bring the focus to these women again. How? Why? That was something. In fact, when you see Kuchipudi, since you asked about the history of dance performance, I will talk about Kuchipudi, Shruti.
Yeah.
Kuchipudi itself is a lovely dance form because it is based on all the indigenous forms. The Yakshagana that is much celebrated comes from the Pagati Veshalu, which is daylight theater that's danced by marginalized communities, men who do Stri Vesham and who do it on the roads. It is something that these men went there and learned. Just give me 1 minute, my dog is eating my sari up. Okay, sorry. And that is the Yakshagana part of it. We have 3 genres in Kuchipudi. One is Yakshagana. The second one is Bhama Kalapam. Bhama Kalapam was something that's written for the Kalavantulu. That's a very Telugu Kalavantulu specific genre, which was written for the Kalavantulu. In every village at the temple, there were the Brahmin scholars who wrote for the particular Devadasi of that temple, and the script is dedicated to that deity. Even if the deity is Shiva and the Bhama Kalapam is on Krishna, they would write it, the format is the same, the screenplay is the same, but the content is different, the literature is different. So in effect, we have about 100 Bhama Kalapams, which are all stored away in the Oriental Manuscript Library. Oh. And even within, this is something very beautiful. You know, this is maybe a late 18th, 19th century genre that has begun. Each family, like I have learned from Anna Battula Mangatayargar, I have learned the Bhama Kalapam from her, and her grandmother, Buli Venkatratnama, was very famous for it. So they do one version of the Bhama Kalapam, which was written by Atkuri Subbarao Garu. Okay. There is another version of Bhama Kalapam, which is written by Gaddam Subbarayadu Shastri, which Kala Krishna, the other dancer, does. So there are so many of them, each for one family. You know, it's a very, very rich, and the literature is so beautiful. It's all Telugu. To the maximum extent, it is the non-Sanskritized Telugu. So it's very, for common man, it's something they relate to, and it's very sweet. Right. Now, a version of this Bhama Kalapam is done in Kuchipudi. Is it performed in the same way that the Kalavantulu families do it? No. They have Yakshaganamized it a little bit. They have kind of made it into the Kuchipudi Yakshagana format, and they do it, but the script is the same. Okay. I mean, the screenplay is the same. Solo. Now, that's Yakshagana, Bhama Kalapam, which has come from here. The Ekaharya Lasyanga, to say it very Sanskritically. the solo form, basically. The solo is a complete takeaway from the Devadasis. This is something Vedantam Lakshminarayana Shastri Garu he was in touch with the Devadasis all around the Kuchipudi village. By the way, Kuchipudi is situated in the midst of Devadasi temples, the Kalavantulu temples and places that they are in. So you have a space where there is Pagati Vesham, which is performed Gaddipadu, which is just off Kuchipudi border. You have Srikakulam Andhra Mahavishnu temple, where Krishna Devaraya had patronized thousands of Devadasis, Kalavantulu women, in where Amukta Mailada was written. Then there are other places all around. In the midst of that, you have this Brahmin families, men, dancing women-oriented dances. How? Okay. Besides that, the whole solo repertoire that has come in here was from Lakshminarayan Shastri Garu, who brought women back because of his exposure to these ladies. Okay. He was the one who brought them back, and he brought the padams, the javalis, the varnams, the tarangams, swarapallavis, except maybe the daruvus, which are from the Yakshaganam. Everything else has come from the Devadasis into Kuchipudi. So already there, and of course there is absolutely no acknowledgement. And on the other side, they say, we went and taught the Kalavantulu women some dancing. We refined their dance and we went and taught them some dancing. The only teaching that happened from here to there was when Lakshminarayana Shastri Garu, who was a visionary, took this dance, this Varnam that was performed by the Kalavantulu here, and it was all in Andhra. The Kalavantulu dancers died out earlier. I mean, at least artistically, they stopped dancing earlier than in Tamil Nadu. Okay. So Balama was still performing there. By then, here there was no space at all. We had the Mughal rule earlier, right? So he took this there, and he taught Balama. He said, only you can do this. He didn't, by then there was already, the nationalist movement had begun, and there were dancers coming in from other communities, Brahmin communities who were dancing. He didn't go to them. He went to Balama. And he said, only you can preserve this. And her mother, JML, gave him the house, and he taught her. So that was the only place where there is teaching happening from here to there. Right. With so much reverence, which means there was a give and take at that time. Right.
I just want to chime in on that, actually, because my mother would talk about, there was always, whatever was spoken about, there was always a setting that they all had to give. So he would come in on his rickshaw, and he was I think in the 70s or 80s by that time. And he had very severe, his acharam that he followed. He wouldn't drink water in our house, so he would bring his own water. He would come in the late afternoons, and Jaima Patti would sing. And she would sing, and she would sing, and she would sing, and she would sing one padam as long as he improvised. And a lot of the Varnam improvisation that Balama learned was from him. Okay. And the way that she also learned was through complete observation. He would do the kai, as they say in Tamil, and she would watch. And whatever she absorbed, that's where the stylistically what she took it out of the Kuchipudi genre of what he did and adapted it to what she felt was appropriate aesthetically for Bharatanatyam.
Right.
So and she spoke about that very reverentially within the family also, that that was the source of Kandappa expanded the nirtya, and Gauri Amma and Lakshminarayana Shastri, just completely fed into what the Bala Saraswati style was about.
Yes, beautiful.
Yes.
And just a point here is that Lakshminarayan Shastri Garu brought it directly from the Kalavantulu to Balamma. So it was not Kuchipudi-ized in between.
Okay.
It didn't take that route. That's why
Yes.
she accepted it. And today in Kuchipudi, nobody does Varnam. He was the only one who did Varnam because his source was the Kalavantulu.
There's
So fascinating.
so much, yeah, so fascinating, so much to parse, so many nuances, and like just now, and now I understand why Kuchipudi doesn't have a Varanam. I always wondered, because in the Bharatanatyam Margam, there's always the Varnam, which is the crux, and all the kids here, that will be part of their college essay too, that they sustained it and they were resilient through the Arangetram. So back to our term of resilience. But so fascinating. I just wish we just didn't have only like this hour to have this conversation. But luckily we don't need this Zoom right away. So I'm going to ask you one more question each, and then we can wrap up. So so many of the things that we have talked about, like there were occasions why performances happened. We have talked about like there were street performances, there were temple performances, and then there was sort of like how the West Africans have their griots, where they're the oral history keepers, right? And they at every like birth or whatever there is that. And each griot comes from one family line. So it's sort of, we have all that similarities in some of the styles and the history. So my question to each of you is that each of these styles have morphed, survived, come, and then they've all become these proscenium shows now, right? I mean, and now maybe even a virtual square box show, but we'll see. Hopefully it doesn't last for too long and it just is one small blip in history. But what do you think in today's world, dance performance, what is this role it plays in society today? Like, what is the purpose?
B, the same sequence, B, you go first and then.
I was going to say, somebody else goes first this time. Okay, I can try. Then it's a very broad thing, but I've just been hearing the conversation before, and it's just so rich and fascinating. And I learned so much just from this conversation. But I just wanted to just share with you one observation, that just from this conversation, I was just thinking, oh my God, there was so much space for innovation, for doing their own composition and borrowing and exchange. And how did we get here when things are so rigid? And the way people understand classicism is all about rigidity now. I know that as classical dancers, some of us know that there are ways, that has been challenged, and that's not really the right way to think about it. But just from that conversation, it was so obvious that there was so much innovation that was happening within the forms and the exchanges and the borrowings, and what a skewed, impression we are leaving our generations now about what these dances are about. So anyway,
especially sorry, I'm just going to add one thought in there. Like in this current day and age, it's like so much as much as, yes, in some ways they're preserving and taking on to the next generation. In fact, this was a question in the panel before too, which is changing the choreography, but then it's my teachers and it's the Bani, so I'm going to hold on to the choreography. Like there's a lot of that struggle. And in fact, I think my teacher Lalita Srinivasan's also on this chat today, but she always talked about how from the Orison court, the dancers from the Orison court would come to the Mysore court, and that's how all the Ashtapatis were being performed in the Mysore style way before, because there was that interaction and cross-pollination between the types of dances. And in fact, in Mysore style, there's a little bit of the influence of the Tribangi and the Odissi style because of these dances spending time cross-pollinating, working with each other, right? And I think that's the other problem about modern life. Who has the time? Who is willing to give that time just to the art? Like, how many of us can afford to be only artists? I think that's the other side to this whole thing, which, you know, Aniruddha, as well as, you know, there's this financial part, right? Which then how many of them want to do it despite that and stay in it, right? Anyway, sorry, going back to you to the question of what role it plays in society today.
That's a really very broad question. I think that, you know, from my perspective, again, I can say that I'm a, you know, I teach in a college. So dance is now, it has entered universities in many parts of the world, you know, from the kinds of spaces we were talking about, the Kotli milieu or the temple milieu, wherever it was performed before. Now it is getting institutionalized in a different way. So, you know, again, going back to Indian dance and how it was nationalized and institutionalized in the Sangeet Natak academies or in the kendras or in the sabhas, you know, and what purpose did that play? It's always changing, right? What role does it play? It's always changing. The role that it was playing in the Kotli milieu is different. And what community, right? Mm-hmm. And also, I don't think that it's an evolution. Like when we are talking about dance history, generally, there is this understanding of a linear history of, okay, these categories of folk, classical, tribal. First of all, we have to question these categories because these categories make these kinds of concepts very difficult to understand. These categories are made. Mm-hmm. The classical itself is a constructed category, which became very obvious from the exchange right now between Yashoda ji and Aniruddha, right? That it is like, obviously, these categories are constructed. So then the folk category is also constructed, the tribal, and this forming this kind of, this thing evolves from that is not how it happens. It's far more messier, and these exchanges are continuous, and it is easier to think about it not in like a linear straight arc kind of a way. So right now, in terms of institutionalization of the dance, it is entering. So I'm going to approach this question from that angle that, you know, in a modern democratic society, if you are like thinking about those things, then dance can be a wonderful medium to talk about difference, you know, because the body, if you think about it, that how it kind of represents in different bodies and how it represents culture, different kinds of culture that's embodied, you know, how we embody them in the dance as dancers, that really can help us to engage with each other and, you know, break out of some of these boundaries that are, you know, sometimes so politicized that perhaps it can help us to engage and be more empathetic. I think dance, as dancers and musicians, you know, when we are dancing together, I think that we understand that there is a connectivity that happens with music and dance with other people who are in the room. So it creates a kind of empathetic resonance. So I think that dance can be a beautiful medium to understand and empathize with others. And if done right, we can create those communities of empathy, understanding, coming together. And I think that that's one of the ways that, you know, not be critical. I think that the critical facility is also very important, not to kind of not be aware of history in a critical mode, to be critically engaged, to be socially engaged, and to cultivate empathy. I think that's what dance can do. It can't do economics. It can't do physics. That's not what dance does. But these are the things that dance can do, right? To understand culture, to understand community, to empathize and be critical, to engage, you know, with it in a responsible way.
Thank you.
Yashoda ji.
That's not fair. And We don't, Yashoda ji, me, neither of you, please don't. Okay. So that was very beautifully said. I also feel, as you said, in fact, I'm just taking it forward from there. A piece of dance talks so much about the society at that time, what the author, the writer, the poet, the musician, what the feelings were, and in what condition he would have written. And sometimes it even reflects the kingdom, the place, and then you're passing it on. So in India, I just feel the piece of dance is history, a chunk of history by itself. Each piece of dance is a chunk of history by itself. So if I want to choreograph something, I'm creating, tomorrow this becomes history for the next generation. Do I want to change what is there, what was there already? Do I want to completely twist it, change? I don't mean changing one movement or adding one jati or something like that, but change the complete flavor of it. Do I want to make a Shrungara piece into a lofty Jivatma, Paramatma philosophical piece that they don't understand, and then say, so-and-so poet was actually very philosophical, but people never understood him and they made him one Shrungara poet? Why change history to suit your present political state, your politics and your agenda and your career now? If we can do, I think that's the frame. Sorry, you have to listen to the frame also. So, what can dance do? Carry history with it. What can dance do? Unify people, as Dee said, but it can also divide people. What dance can do is what the dancer wants it to do. So the responsibility lies in the hands of the dancer as to what you want to do with the dance. If it's not doing any good for the society, there's no need to dance. It doesn't matter. Everybody doesn't have to do it. Right.
Yeah.
Well, for me, to take it from there, from what Akka said, it's always been the conundrum of how to pass this on, because only recently, within the last 7, 8 years, I've started teaching. But then do you fall into the category of institutionalizing an art form because that's what people expect now, because that's what's actually easier to grasp and move forward? Or do you ensure that there's actually a very select group of students who can actually take on the aesthetic foundation of what the dance is about? So for example, when we talk about, I don't talk to my students too much about choreography. I mean, as far as the nritta goes, I talk about choreography. But for them to understand the dynamic of one's imagination that is needed to have one's own manodharma and to have one's own idea of how to improvise in the abhinaya aspect of it, which has been lost in the contemporary approach to the dance, to Bharatanatyam. I feel that jiva, once that was removed, it has completely lost its essence. It's become a completely different art form. It may sound like I'm contradicting to what I said about compartmentalizing the Devadasi dance to this. I'm talking about a complete aesthetic structure that why is this different? I'm not talking about the social side of it. I'm talking about something of why is this aesthetically different?
Right.
I'm not even talking about context. It's why is this different? What are the approaches? What does each student need to approach? It's just not about the dance. That right now I face students. The dance is in its own in its own sphere, in its own fantasy world. It is its own fantasy world. So when I talk about the Puranas or Muruga or Shiva or Krishna, many of the kids today don't relate to these things. You know, they all go to a temple, but why are they going to the temple? What have they seen? What is the Purana behind that temple? There's no personalized attachment to that. So to teach something that is so fundamentally ingrained in this type of foundation, whether it's the Puranas or whether it's having a certain type of way to even imagining, if, for example, in the Daniki Vardam, when my mother taught me, she said, you have to describe the woman. When you describe her physically, you describe her from the top of the head to the foot. You don't go from the eyes to the eyebrows, to the neck, to the breasts, to the feet, to the hair. There is a certain order and structure even within one's own imagination. It's to be able to have that set grammar and that language, to be erudite, to be able to really communicate what needs to be said with the nuance of the dance.
Right.
How does one communicate that to the next generation when so much needs to be taught before that? That's my conundrum. And it's sort of, a lot of times one feels, it's possible. Sometimes it feels it's impossible because the musical training that's needed, so much. Do people have the time and inclination today to do all of that? I have students who live with me, who are in the familial setting all of the time, because the dance doesn't come from a 6 to 7 or 5 to 9 or whatever the class timing is. It's to be here. It's the time. Even when we eat, for me, it's remnant of nostalgic. I would say, my mother, my family, we make rasam this way. Right. Because my mother would tell me this was how my great grandmother made it. And it's to have that emotional connect to the lineage. Even if you have students from outside, they have to become a part of the family and the family lineage to claim that responsibility and say, no, this is my lineage. It's not something separate. It's not something what you do. What you do later on is what you do, but there has to be a certain claim to it from within.
So to that point, I just want to ask you, how important is it to you to, yes, carry that lineage on and teach it to students, but also that they have to be genetically from that lineage? Do you
both
have
to?
No, do you have
both?
Students? Okay.
Yes.
No, I was like, do you have students who come seeking who are from the lineage of the hereditary dancers, like how Yashoda went in search of the Kalavantulu style and wanted to learn? Do you have hereditary dancers who want to come?
No. That hasn't happened yet. So we'll see what time gives.
No, because we had in one of the previous panels, one of the conversations was, where are the hereditary dancers? And I do know there's been this movement in India where some of them are like speaking up about their heritage and about the whole, like you were talking, the classism and Brahminism and all that stuff. And so yes. I'm trying to see, where are they? Are they going to come out and learn and take on the art form? And
even within my family, to find 2 generations ago, there were 10-12 people who were performing, musicians, mridangas, violinists, vocalists, dancers. Today in my family, there's only 2. There's my cousin Girish, who's a vocalist from Vrindama side, and it's me from Balama side. There has been no inclination from within the family to even understand what the family is about. Even within the family, there's a certain shying away from it. I began teaching my cousin, who was my age, literally my age, we're a month apart. She had no exposure to dance or music her entire life. 4 months ago, she showed up after 20 years of not seeing her. She said, I want to learn about our family tradition. I want to learn the dance. I want to be at least exposed to it. And it was a complete shock to me that she had no concept or perception of that. But it was also something that was very emotional to me, because even within the family, there was no encouragement to do what I do. It was just, well, that's, and I guess that also comes from being in the shadow of both my mother and Balama, because that, it's the entire generation of my family still is in that nostalgia of what was 40, 50, 60 years ago. But the reality and the practicality of that for me, I can't live in that because I wasn't exposed to it.
Right.
You have to be able to take that and try to make it your own. Yes, Yashoda.
Yeah, so sorry, Annie, I'm sorry I cut in. What you're saying is so true. So there is this WhatsApp group full of my family, which loves me, which are very, very affectionate, but they will not come to dancing. Very pretty girls, very exuberant, lots of energy.
They won't even come for concerts.
They will not. Exactly. They will not come for the concert. There is my podcast which I made so that my family listens. It's not about others. I said, for my family, at least when they're driving, they listen to the podcast and they get to know about the background. No, they will not do it. So am I blaming them? I'm not blaming them. There was a time when I was angry, I was sad, I cried and I pleaded with them. But now I begin to understand that this is a trauma that's going through generations. It's taking time. Since we spoke about resilience, which is a part of the topic, the first necessity was to educate themselves and educate themselves in English education.
Yes.
Telugu vachina rakapaina, whether you can speak Telugu or not, it doesn't matter. You must know English. So in effect, I call my parents mommy and daddy. I don't call them amma nana. That's how I call my mamas and mommies uncle and auntie. So my children, I say, no, please call them by your local, whatever you talk. So there is this very conscious, vehement need to educate yourself in software as a chartered accountant, not in psychology, not in literature, not in history, no. Engineer or doctor, and go abroad, become a CEO of a company or become something very big. And then we will see the others are dancing. It's okay. Let them dance. Why rake up all this now? You are dancing, China. Very nice, very beautiful. That is nice. My daughter, we will see when she grows. So that has education really changed the situation? Who is responsible for this? The wound is very deep, Shruti. It is not as easy. I know this question is thrown at me on Facebook or on the road or everywhere by so many dancers who say, so who's stopping them from dancing? Who's stopping your family from dancing? Ask them to come. We will give them programs. Very rudely, I hear this statement. It's not that easy. No. If my father says, China, the history you are talking, China is my pet name. The history that you are talking about is all very nice. It's all very convincing. But what I have seen in the place of Peddapuram is when our relatives had to dance on the streets, they had to just do acrobatic movements on the streets, and people would fall all over them. They did it for a few coins. That is the vision I have in my mind. Right. And so many of our relatives have seen this. If they don't want to come back to music and dance, this is the reason they don't want to come back. So then I try to tell them there is more, but whatever I tell them is something I told, not what they have seen.
Yes. Yes. And, and I think that's this whole thing of getting education and finding this financial stability, and it's sort of wrapped into this thing of the capitalistic world of respectability, right? Your success is surrounded by your paycheck, your education and things like that. And also, unfortunately, Indian society, as much as it lauds the arts, there isn't, I still remember when I was 18, when I was trying to get into college, engineer, medicine, or maybe law. Oh, it doesn't work, commerce. Then if you are really, unfortunate to use the word dumb, but if you're like really not intelligent enough and didn't get into all that, okay, you went to arts. Like that's how we view it. And, that's why we have William Dalrymple writing about our Indian history, where nobody in India now wants to spend that time learning about it and writing and researching. And there are people, but then first of all, they don't get published. That's all very complicated, other issues. But still, it's just so interesting that we are comfortable with that. Like even in the US, pursuing Indian classical dance as your career is mostly women who have come here, who have learned in India, who then come, are married, then they have a husband who also has another job, and the woman is then pursuing dance. There are people now breaking out of that mold, but it is out of that comfort thing, and that's when it happens, right? And even going into college and learning the arts is much the next harder step. And I think that's sort of evolution of society. I guess when the modern India, the 75 years of like modernism, capitalism, globalization, and then suddenly okay, let's look back. And I hope we are at that precipice of looking back and inquiry to inform ourselves, to then take it on to the next generation and reclaiming sort of each of our own identities, understanding where we fit in that bigger tapestry than just here and now today, right? And I think that's what I hope for our next generation, for people like you, Yashoda and Aniruddha, and when the more you talk about this, the more you think there's more acceptability, that more people want to look up to you as role models and come into this art form, because it's so precious. And anyway, I think that's my.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I know our time is running out, but I just want to also respect the people that I studied, the research that I did. And just to say that, yes, I also found the same kinds of issues with not wanting to talk about themselves also, because their children were going to schools and so forth. But to also acknowledge the fact that although they are seldom dancing Kathak, they are dancing more Bollywood these days because of the clients. But the Thawaif community, or the people who belong to, it's like they had many names. I'm not even going into the heterogeneous complexity of that community. They are still dancing in the red light areas. That dance is the lineage also. And it might not look like the dance that's happening, in some elite classroom in in Calcutta or in Bombay or in some other city in Delhi, but to acknowledge that they are also dancing, still dancing, and that they are also, that we should include, like, that is the part of the culture also.
Yeah.
The inclusive aspect of this tradition is that we have to also acknowledge that these women are still prostitutes and dancing, basically, and to accept the fact that that is also part of our tradition, and nothing we cannot just say, okay, now we have all moved on. We have really kind of be part of a very complex whole, where they are also part of the story. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that in. And again, I think it's really important to understand that, and that it's all fits into that larger system of what really exists outside each of our classes and stages, because I think people only focus on a stage versus whatever happens to get to that stage or not get to that stage, right? So, but thank you so much. I think this could have gone on for hours, and and I, definitely am very, very happy, honored, and thankful for each of you for sharing and being here with us. And hopefully we can continue to have such conversations and find more and more, pathways to get the information back and in and out and continue this cross-pollination of ideas and exchanges. And thank you so much. And we'll see you hopefully soon, everybody.
A real pleasure to work with all of you too.
Yes, it's